Let's talk to Ben Habib, former Deputy Leader at Reform UK. Ben, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike.
I mean, this government lurches from one disaster to another. I'm not quite sure what we've got in store this week, but the assisted dying bill could do worse than put the Labour Party out of its misery, couldn't it? I mean, you know, cruel and unusual punishment notwithstanding.
Well, I mean, on the assisted dying bill, you know, the last thing we need is this government, which has already evidenced its incompetence, to be given the right to put people to sleep.
Yes.
I mean, it's absolutely absurd, isn't it? If you ever needed any example of why the state shouldn't have such a massive massive capability to interfere literally in our lives, it's this government.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't give Keir Starmer or any one of his cabinet ministers or anyone that they direct any authority over any life, frankly.
No.
And,
well, they've proven themselves to be completely and utterly incompetent. I was talking to some people over the weekend about how bad they have been. I mean, I didn't think they would be this bad. And I say this every week, you know, that with every week that passes, I think to myself, surely they must have learnt something about the business of governance, but they don't seem to have. They don't seem to have anybody in the cabinet or in the government at all that knows what they're doing.
No, they haven't. And the budget was awful. You know, the OBR, because it's ideologically, the Office of Budget Responsibility that vets the budget, it's ideologically sort of aligned with big state, high taxation and high regulation. So it reluctantly gave its blessing to the budget, but saying that it was, you know, very finely balanced, that the budget could tip us into a bad economic position. And that's actually what we're seeing at the moment. Sterling is down 7% against the dollar in the last 3 months. You know, people are not really looking at sterling, but that's at a time when inflation is beginning to show its head.
Yeah.
Now, when inflation normally shows its head, people think, okay, well, interest rates are going up and your currency strengthens a bit. But if your currency continues to drop when inflation is going up, what that tells you is that international investors are giving up on sterling. And that's very bad for the government because it needs to fund an ever bigger hole in its finances. And that requires investors to believe in sterling and believe in the United Kingdom. And this government could end up in a position where actually the economy starts to shrink.
Yeah.
Interest rates have to go up. Sterling continues to fall. And there's a strike by investors on buying British government bonds. And that puts the government into a critical financial position.
Yeah.
Before you know it, it's going to the IMF cap in hand. And even though that petition that is doing so well online may not force an election, if you have a government, no matter how big its majority, that bankrupts the UK and has to go to the IMF for a bailout, well, I think things could change at that point.
Well, that's what I've always said, you know, and I've said this since July when they came in and people used to laugh at me and say, what are you talking about? They're in for the next 4 or 5 years with a massive majority. Don't be so stupid. I kept saying, look, I have a feeling in my bones, I don't know what it is, that this government is so useless and so hopeless that something will happen, some event will happen which will be cataclysmic, which will make us have to have another election. Because also the people who are voting in this mass signature event, which is currently now at 1,828,000. You know, when I started the show, it was at just 179. So you're basically looking at 30,000 people have signed it in the last hour alone, right? So I reckon it's going to make 2 million before the end of my show. The bottom line is that people are fed up, not because the government are bad, but because the government got in, as far as they know, on false pretences. They pretended that they were going to be a government for the people. They pretended they were going to be a government of change for the good, when in fact all the things they're doing are changing everything for the worse.
Yeah, I mean, they promised, like Rishi Sunak did, that they stopped the boats, but actually effectively what they've done is given those who've entered the country illegally, effectively given them asylum. They haven't said it, but that's what's happened.
They've arrested that bloke from Turkey who apparently was all down to him. No, so we're all safe in our beds, you know.
So they've done that. They said they wouldn't tax the working class, but the employers increase in national insurance, the increase in employers' national insurance, targeted principally the working class because they lowered the threshold from £9,000 per annum to just over £5,000 per annum. That hit literally the working class. They restricting laws on employment, so that, you know, the working time directive that limited the number of hours to 40 hours a week, which was only very limited application in the United Kingdom, that's going to have very broad applications. They're getting rid of 0-hour contracts. They're increasing the minimum wage. All of this, they might think helps employees. Actually, what it does is burden business. And when you burden business with extra taxes, extra regulations, business will do one of two things. They will either sack people, or they will cease to give them increases in their salaries.
Yeah.
One way or another, people get poorer. And if they do sack people, then the state gets poorer, because the state then has to pay benefits. People who were paying tax on their wages end up being a burden to the state. And you get into a spiral out of which it's very difficult to get. And that's the position that the United Kingdom is in. And all the indicators, by the way, we had a purchasing managers index out the other day, which was below 50%, which means that more purchasing managers are forecasting a downturn than they are an upturn. And other signals are also heading towards a recession. And if we end up in a recession with inflation up, I mean, you see the picture. Yeah. It's all very, very bad.
It is, and you're absolutely right, because the figures this morning back up exactly what you've just said, because the CBI has announced under Chief Executive Rain Newton-Smith that the tax rises that have been put on since the budget must never again be done to business. He says this: a poll of business leaders by the CBI found that 62% say they will cut their hiring plans. Almost half of them said they'll be forced to lay people off, and 46% are looking to delay pay rises. So that's exactly what you've just said, but it's actually in real. This is in real time, and we also know that even the Labour Party's own tax advisor, Dan Needle, who was previously quoted very excitedly by Keir Starmer as the man who knew everything, who said, oh yeah, the farming inheritance tax is only going to affect 500 farms. Well, he's now come back on that and said, actually, it goes too far now in how it applies to actual farms, and he's worked out that a third of farming estates affected by the changes to agricultural relief are owned by tax-avoiding investors. The rest of it, 66%, is owned by proper farmers.
Yeah, and I mean, that's an invidious change in the taxation regime. It's going to force patrician farming, which is so critical, because it's not exactly, you don't get rich becoming a farmer, let me tell you. It's a tough old business. And patrician farming, where families do it generation after generation, where they develop the skills, where they love toiling the land because that's what they do, that will end. And if that ends, we are going to be a much, much poorer country for it. We've already offshored 40% of our food production. That is not a good thing. You know, at the same time that we're firing missiles into Russia, fearing that Russia may respond, we should be food independent. And by the way, we should also be building up our defenses. I mean, you couldn't make it up, just slightly digressing for a second. You know, the Storm Shadow missiles were fired into Russia the same day that our defenses were cut by £500 million.
I know.
I mean, it's absolutely absurd.
Well, they seem to like the figure of 500 million because they want to collect 500 million from the inheritance tax on farmers. They also want to give another 500 million away to farmers in Asia and Africa and South America to help them with their climate change challenges. I mean, you could not make this stuff up.
No. And COP29, which you mentioned just before I came on, that has turned into nothing more than a global wealth redistribution program. The developing countries are using the excuse of climate change to cloak themselves in moral correctitude and demanding that the West pay out money. And we just agreed, as you said, I think it's 330 billion pounds. I mean, that's an extraordinary amount of money.
I know.
When you think,
where's that coming from?
No, it's extraordinary. And and at home, our pensioners are being, having their heating turned off. Veterans are having to sleep rough. Unemployment is rising. The whole, I mean, it's just massive mismanagement. And so you say the Labour Party's broken their promises. Of course, they have broken their promises, but they are also utterly incompetent.
Yeah. They are, and there's no question about that. And we haven't even started on the non-crime hate incidents. We've got that this morning in the Telegraph after the absolutely brilliant, news that we had last week that the police are no longer going to investigate Alison Pearson, as if that's all right then. Luckily for us and for freedom of speech, Alison is going after them, and she's going, well, hang on a minute, you don't just get away with that. You don't just turn up on my doorstep, terrorise me and my family, get me to the point where I'm so worried I can't sleep at night because I think you're going to come and lock me up for something that I didn't even do without telling me what it was. She now wants answers as to why, despite the fact that she was advised by several experts that her non-crime hate incident did not merit being investigated in the first place, certainly didn't merit being accelerated up the scale to an actual crime, and she wants to know who made those decisions, who took those decisions, and why 2 police officers were dispatched to her house on Remembrance Sunday. This morning, it turns out that former Metropolitan Police Commissioner Hogan Howe, Lord Hogan Howe, says that the police are spending 60,000 hours a year on these cases instead of actually fighting crime.
The Alison story is enough to make the hair rise on the back of your neck. And for every Alison, there are 12,999 other people, I think it's around 13,000 people, a year are investigated for non-crime hate incidents. Now, if Alison Strong, she had the courage somehow to fight this, and she had a public voice with which to fight it. But the other 12,999 people, actually, many of them won't have the wherewithal to do it. Many will want to just curl up into a ball and disappear. Can you imagine what it feels like to have 2 policemen turn up on your doorstep, investigating you for something that literally is not a criminal activity, but they log it as a crime? And there are young children being investigated. Effectively, free speech at school is being shut down. Now, a crucial part of education is the ability to express yourself, no matter how repugnant, in order that you can be challenged through debate, be educated. And if you take free speech out of schools, you end up with indoctrination. And, you know, that's where we're going as a country. And I read that, you know, they want, the Home Secretary wants new guidance given to police officers. It's not about guidance. We have to repeal the very laws on which these non-crime hate incidents are based. The hate speech laws need to go. But Yvette Cooper, of course, is at 6s and 7s with herself because she wants to use the non-crime hate incident law, the law that, you know, underpins it, to diminish what she calls a risk of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. But that's bringing in, and this is precisely what she's doing, she's bringing in blasphemy laws through the back door. And we abolished blasphemy laws over 100 years ago. As a nation, we're going backwards. Free speech is being dumbed down. That would, you know, Alison's investigation and the other 13,000 odd people who are investigated, that's all shutting down of free speech. Children being investigated at school is a shutting down of free speech. Blasphemy laws is a shutting down of free speech. And if you shut down free speech, you do not have democracy. That is precisely where we're going. We're living in some kind of Orwellian, Kafkaesque, dystopian world. This is not the United Kingdom. Well, this is not the United Kingdom.
I've got plenty of advice for them on the subject of, you know, common sense guidance, which is what they say they're going to give the police, right, from the Home Office. I mean, the idea the Home Office has got any common sense in it at all is laughable, right? But here's the common sense guidance from me. The first 2 words, non-crime. So therefore, if you're a police officer, you're not interested in non-crime incidents. Why would you be? But they say, and this is where it gets slightly sinister, they say police will be told only to record these incidents when there is a clear risk to community tensions. You can imagine what they're going to do with that, can't you?
Absolutely. And while we're on the subject, you know, many people, after the Southport, there were the protests, you remember, after the Southport killing, the protest and the rioters. And Keir Starmer undoubtedly politicised the criminal justice system when he got up and he said all those people protesting were far right and they should be incarcerated. Now, you can imagine many, many people, in my view, during that process were incarcerated wrongly because of stuff they'd put on Twitter, because of stuff they'd said, because of stuff they'd put on placards when they went out and they walked, including a chap, and I just want to remind viewers of him, Peter Lynch, who's a 61-year-old pensioner, a grandfather, who'd never broken the law before. He said a few things to the police. He was charged with violent criminal activity. Actually, all the evidence presented against him was the stuff that he said to the police and what he had on his placard. For reasons that are not clear, he pleaded guilty. He was locked up for 2 years and 8 months, and he killed himself a month or 2 later in prison because he couldn't take it. Now, that is serious injustice. And the Prime Minister, Yvette Cooper, and Merseyside Police still haven't come clean on what happened during that entire process, what it was the Prime Minister knew, what it was Merseyside police knew, and whether or not the people who were protesting and those who tweeted and said things, whether or not they were right, and whether or not they've been wrongly incarcerated. There's been a massive, in my view, massive miscarriage of justice following the Southport riots, and Peter Lynch's death should be investigated, as should the incarcerations of so many other people. If they can knock on Alison Pearson's door on Sunday morning for a tweet that she deleted a year ago that was only online for an hour, they will be coming after many, many of us.
Yeah. Absolutely right. And meanwhile, the big story for Keir Starmer this morning is his summit on spiking drinks. You know, I mean, do me a favour. It might be an important story, but, you know, there's a lot of other things going on right now this morning, Ben, that you should be dealing with. Thank you very much indeed. Ben Habib, former Deputy Leader, Reform UK.